I have been in finance long enough to know the difference between a cycle and a reset. Cycles happen all the time. Markets go up, markets come down, central banks tighten, central banks ease, assets reprice and then settle back into familiar ranges. Most of what gets called a major shift in financial media is actually just a cycle. Noise dressed up as signal. I have watched enough of those to recognize them quickly and ignore them efficiently. What I want to talk to you about today is not a cycle. It is something that happens once or twice in a generation, something that most people only recognize clearly in retrospect, and something that the convergence of data points I am going to walk you through suggests is not approaching. It is already here. The reset I am describing is monetary. It is the process by which the global financial system recalibrates its relationship with the assets that have served as the foundation of monetary credibility across every civilization in recorded history. Gold and silver, not as relics, not as commodities, as the instruments through which the market expresses its honest assessment of what paper promises are actually worth when the institutions behind those promises can no longer be fully trusted. That reassessment is underway right now. The data is not ambiguous about this, and the people who understand what is happening are already positioned. The people who are waiting for the mainstream financial press to confirm it will, as they always have in these moments, be too late. My name is Marcus Vale. Before I built this channel, I spent over a decade as an analyst inside the financial system, close enough to the center of it to understand how it actually works rather than how it presents itself to the public. The most important thing I learned in those years is that the gap between the official narrative and the data underneath it is never larger than at major inflection points. And the gap right now around precious metals, around the trajectory of the global monetary order, is as wide as anything I observed during my entire time inside that system. Let me show you what the data looks like. Start with central banks, because central bank behavior is the most reliable leading indicator in monetary history. These institutions do not speculate. They do not chase trends. They move slowly with enormous analytical resources, and they move strategically. What central banks have been doing with gold for the past 3 years is not ambiguous. According to the World Gold Council, global central bank gold purchases hit their highest level since 1967 in 2022. They remained near record pace in 2023. They continued in 2024. We are now in the third consecutive year of central bank gold accumulation at historically extreme levels. The People's Bank of China has been adding to its official gold reserves in nearly every reporting period. India, Poland, Turkey, Singapore, the Czech Republic, and dozens of other nations have been systematically increasing their gold holdings while reducing their exposure to dollar-denominated assets. This is not a trade. This is a structural repositioning of global monetary reserves away from paper assets and toward physical metal. When the institutions responsible for managing the monetary foundations of sovereign nations make that kind of move at that kind of scale and sustain it across multiple years, they are telling you something about what they believe is coming that no press release will ever state directly. The reason for that repositioning became explicit in February 2022 when the United States and European governments froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western financial institutions. In the history of the modern financial system, that had never happened to a G20 nation before. The message it sent to every finance ministry and central bank outside the Western alliance was immediate and visceral. Reserves held in dollars, in euros, in Western custody are not neutral financial assets. They are instruments of political leverage that can be rendered inaccessible through administrative decision in a matter of days. The only reserve asset that is genuinely immune to that risk, the only one that cannot be frozen, sanctioned, or confiscated remotely, is physical gold sitting inside your own sovereign territory. That realization did not create the gold buying trend, but it dramatically accelerated it. And it gave the trend a character that distinguishes it from every previous central bank gold cycle. This is not portfolio diversification. This is insurance against a financial system that has revealed itself to be weaponizable. Now add the fiscal picture, because the monetary reset does not happen in isolation from the debt environment that is driving it. The United States is carrying $36 trillion in national debt that grows by approximately $3 billion every single day. The Congressional Budget Office projects that annual interest payments on that debt will exceed $1 trillion, making debt service the single largest item in the federal budget. The political system has demonstrated across multiple administrations and multiple Congresses a complete inability to address that trajectory through conventional fiscal means. Tax increases large enough to matter are politically toxic. Spending cuts deep enough to close the gap are politically impossible given the entitlement commitments already in place. The Federal Reserve, which is theoretically independent but practically constrained by the fiscal reality it operates within, faces a choice between keeping rates high enough to fight inflation and thereby compounding the debt service problem, or cutting rates to relieve fiscal pressure and thereby reigniting inflationary dynamics. There is no clean path. And historically, when governments have been trapped in that position, the resolution has always involved monetary expansion that erodes the purchasing power of the currency. Always. The form varies. The outcome does not. Gold and silver are the assets that price that outcome in advance, not perfectly, not on a neat schedule, but with a consistency across monetary history that the data makes impossible to dismiss. In the 1970s, after Nixon ended dollar convertibility to gold, gold went from $35 an ounce to $850. Silver went from under $2 to nearly $50. After the 2008 financial crisis and the monetary expansion that followed, gold more than doubled and silver briefly approached its 1980 high. The pattern is not coincidental. It reflects a relationship between monetary credibility and hard asset valuation that has operated across centuries and across dozens of different monetary systems. When the credibility of paper money comes into genuine question, the things that cannot be printed do not merely hold their value. They reprice dramatically to absorb the purchasing power that is fleeing the paper alternative. The silver side of this reset deserves specific attention because it is the dimension that most financial commentary underweights most severely. Silver is carrying two simultaneous roles in the current environment that gold alone does not carry. It is a monetary metal responding to the same currency credibility dynamics that are driving gold, and it is an industrial metal facing a structural supply deficit driven by demand that is not speculative and not reversible. The Silver Institute confirmed 3 consecutive years of global silver deficit through 2024, meaning the world is consuming more silver than it mines every year with no near-term resolution in sight. Solar panel manufacturing alone is projected to require over 200 million ounces of silver annually by 2026, up from roughly 100 million ounces 5 years earlier. Electric vehicles, military electronics, semiconductors, and medical devices add to that industrial floor. Silver's electrical conductivity has no viable substitute in most of these applications. The demand is structural, the supply response is slow, and the monetary demand that gold is already experiencing has historically followed gold into silver with a lag that the data suggests is now expiring. The gold-to-silver ratio sits between 85 and 90 to 1 at current prices. The long-run historical average is between 50 and 60 to 1. That gap, between where silver trades relative to gold today and where the historical relationship says it should trade, represents one of the widest valuation discrepancies between the two metals in the modern era. The last time the ratio was at comparable extremes, in 2020, silver subsequently outperformed gold by a factor of roughly 3 to 1 in the recovery that followed. The time before that, in the post-2008 environment, silver went from under $9 to nearly $50, while gold moved from roughly $750 to well $900, a dramatically larger percentage move in silver off the same monetary foundation. The monetary reset that is underway does not treat gold and silver as separate stories. It treats them as two instruments through which the same underlying repricing expresses itself, with silver carrying additional industrial demand pressure that makes its supply-demand math even more constrained than gold's. The BRICS dimension adds the global architecture to a picture that might otherwise look like a purely American fiscal problem. Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the growing coalition of nations that have joined or aligned with that framework represent a collective effort to build a monetary and trade infrastructure that reduces dependence on the dollar. The petrodollar arrangement that has anchored global dollar demand since the early 1970s, the system by which oil is priced in dollars globally, creating structural demand for the currency regardless of U.S. fiscal behavior, is being deliberately circumvented through bilateral trade agreements that settle energy and commodity transactions in local currencies. Every transaction settled outside the dollar system reduces the structural demand that has allowed Washington to export the consequences of its fiscal excess to the rest of the world for 50 years. That reduction in structural dollar demand is not a crisis event. It is a slow, grinding erosion of the foundation that makes the current monetary arrangement sustainable. And as that foundation erodes, the assets that carry no national credit risk, no political jurisdiction risk, and no printing press risk become more valuable relative to the paper alternatives. That is gold. That is silver. That is the reset the data is describing. I want to be direct about what the word reset means in this context, because it is a word that gets used loosely and often hyperbolically in financial commentary. I am not describing the end of the dollar. I am not predicting a Mad Max scenario or the collapse of civilization. A monetary reset, in historical terms, is a repricing event. It is the process by which assets that have been undervalued relative to the monetary reality catch up to the reality. It happened in 1933 when Roosevelt revalued gold from $20 to $35 an ounce. It happened across the 1970s as the post-Bretton Woods monetary order was established. It happened incrementally through the 2000s and accelerated after 2008. Each of those episodes was a reset of the relationship between paper money and hard assets. Each of them rewarded people who held the hard assets and penalized people who trusted the paper promises at the moment of recalibration. What makes the current moment different from previous resets is the simultaneity of the pressures, fiscal, monetary, geopolitical, industrial, converging at the same time, at a scale that the data says is historically unusual. The framework the data supports is not complicated. Physical metal, gold and silver in allocated storage or personal possession, is the cleanest expression of the reset thesis because it has no counterparty. It cannot be diluted by a central bank decision. It cannot be frozen by a government executive order. It cannot go bankrupt the way a financial institution can. It is the monetary asset that has survived every reset in history because it is, by its physical nature, outside the system being reset. Mining equities and royalty companies offer leveraged participation for investors who want directional exposure through conventional markets with the additional risks that operational and jurisdictional complexity introduces. Both have roles in thinking about portfolio construction in a monetary reset environment. What does not have a role, based on what the data is currently showing, is the assumption that the monetary status quo will persist indefinitely without consequence. I'm Marcus Vail. The central banks are telling you something through their actions that they will never say through their words. The debt data is telling you something through its trajectory that the political class is structurally prevented from acknowledging. The industrial supply deficit in silver is telling you something through 3 consecutive years of numbers that the mainstream commodity analysis somehow keeps underweighting, and the gold-to-silver ratio is telling you something through its historically extreme reading that the financial press has not yet decided is worth a headline. I am not asking you to take my word for any of this. Every number I cited today is publicly available and verifiable in minutes. What I am asking you to do is look at those numbers together as a system rather than in the isolated way that financial media presents them. Because when you see them together, the picture they paint is not subtle. The reset is not coming. The data says it is already here.